The email looked harmless at first. White background, polite font. The kind of message hospitals send when they want to remind you about parking validation or an upcoming appointment. I opened it standing in my kitchen, one hand braced against the counter because my hip had been screaming since dawn. By the second sentence, my vision blurred. My insurance coverage had been voluntarily canceled, effective immediately. All benefits closed at my request. I read it 3 times, waiting for my brain to catch up, voluntarily. As if I had woken up one morning and decided I no longer needed the surgery that kept me walking. As if I had casually chosen to gamble with the joints that were already deteriorating faster than my doctors were comfortable admitting. The authorization for my operation was revoked. The hospital could not proceed. Without coverage, the cost would be more than I made in a year. I work in medical insurance analytics. I know exactly how rare it is for a policy like mine to be canceled without months of documentation. This did not happen by accident. This happened because someone asked for it to happen. Someone had spoken in my name. The timing made my stomach drop. My father's estate hearing was scheduled in less than 3 weeks. Without the surgery, I would not be able to sit through a full day in court, let alone stand to testify. If I didn't show up, the court would assume my silence was consent. Absence would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness in my family had always been treated as permission. I lowered myself into a chair, the pain sharp enough to make me breathe through my teeth, and a single thought cut through the panic with frightening clarity. Whoever canceled my insurance didn't just want to save money. They wanted me out of the room. I was 32 years old, financially independent, and employed by one of the largest insurance firms in the country. I lived alone by choice. I paid my bills on time. I had never missed a premium. If this had happened to a client whose data crossed my desk, I would have flagged it immediately as potential fraud. But this wasn't a spreadsheet. This was my body. The condition started when I was a teenager, a joint injury that never healed correctly, compounded by years of compensating movement. My doctors were careful with their language, but the message was consistent. Delay the surgery too long, and the damage could become permanent. I managed the pain quietly. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't ask my family for help. Experience had taught me that doing so only invited commentary instead of care. In the Ashcroft family, illness was tolerated only if it was temporary and invisible. Long-term conditions were rebranded as personality traits. I wasn't sick. I was difficult. I wasn't in pain. I was overly sensitive. I learned early that if I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to present facts, not feelings. That morning, facts were all I had. I called the hospital first. The billing coordinator sounded apologetic, almost embarrassed, as if she could feel the wrongness of what she was saying. The system showed a recorded request to terminate coverage. Identity verified. Decision confirmed. File closed. There was nothing she could do unless the insurer reinstated the policy. When I called the insurer, the answer was the same. Calm, procedural. The representative read from notes as if they were sacred text. Yes, the request had come from me. Yes, the verification questions had been answered correctly. Yes, the caller had stated that ongoing coverage was no longer necessary. I asked for the timestamp. I asked for the call type. I asked if the conversation had been recorded. There was a pause on the line that told me everything before she spoke again. I hung up and stared at my phone, my hands shaking now, not from pain but from certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an action. And actions, unlike accidents, always had owners. I told my family that afternoon. My sister Vanessa replied first. Her tone was flat, almost amused. She said I'd always managed on my own. She said I didn't really need all those benefits. She said I was probably overreacting and should focus on resting instead of stressing myself out over paperwork. My mother followed a minute later. She asked if I was sure I hadn't signed something without reading it carefully. She reminded me that administrative systems could be confusing and suggested I stop jumping to conclusions. Neither of them asked if I was scared. Neither of them asked if I was in pain. Neither of them asked how I was supposed to afford the surgery. I set the phone down and let the silence fill the apartment. I had spent years convincing myself that my family's indifference was a personality mismatch, not a pattern. That they loved me in their own way, even if that way came with constant minimization. But as I replayed the conversations in my head, something shifted. Their responses weren't confused. They were calibrated, as if they were reacting to a plan instead of a problem. I thought of my Aunt Margaret then, a retired nurse who had never softened her advice to spare feelings. Keep your records. Never assume family loyalty protects you legally. Medical systems fail quietly, she used to say, and when they do, they take the vulnerable with them. I had followed that advice at work my entire career. I just hadn't applied it to my own blood. I opened my laptop and pulled every document I had, policy histories, emails, authorization letters, timelines. The more I reviewed, the clearer it became. This cancellation required intent, familiarity, confidence. Whoever made the call knew exactly which words to use and which details to offer. By the time the sun dipped below the window line, my pain had worsened, and my fear had crystallized into something sharper. Resolve. I did not call customer service again. I did not argue with my family. I searched for one thing instead, an attorney who specialized in insurance fraud. In the Ashcroft family, trust was not distributed evenly. It flowed toward whoever made things feel smooth, not toward whoever made things accurate. I learned that distinction early, long before I understood how much it would cost me. Vanessa had always been the easier daughter. She smiled at the right moments, remembered birthdays, knew how to soften bad news before it landed. When she entered a room, conversation adjusted itself around her. People felt reassured in her presence, as if her confidence could organize chaos simply by existing. I was the opposite. I asked questions. I read fine print. I paused before agreeing. In a family that valued comfort over clarity, that made me exhausting. No one ever said it outright, but the labels accumulated quietly. Vanessa was capable. I was particular. Vanessa was practical. I was rigid. By the time we were adults, the roles were so entrenched that even neutral actions were interpreted through them. When Vanessa made decisions quickly, she was decisive. When I hesitated, I was difficult. My illness didn't help, or rather, it helped in the wrong way. At first, after the injury, there was concern. Doctor's visits, physical therapy, the careful language of possibility. But as the years passed and the condition didn't resolve itself neatly, concern hardened into impatience. Pain that lasted too long made people uncomfortable. Pain that couldn't be seen invited commentary. "You've always had something," my mother used to say, not unkindly, as if stating a fact about my personality instead of my body. "You manage most days," Vanessa would add, as if that meant the other days didn't count. I learned to minimize my own experience to match their tolerance. I stopped mentioning flare-ups. I scheduled procedures quietly and took ride shares instead of asking for help. I became meticulous with calendars and records, partly because it suited my mind, partly because it reduced the chance of being questioned. If everything was documented, no one could accuse me of exaggeration. Over time, the illness stopped being treated as a medical condition and became shorthand for who I was. I wasn't cautious because the pain demanded it. I was cautious because that was just my nature. I wasn't reserved because I was tired. I was reserved because I lacked warmth. The story rewrote itself so many times that even I started to forget the original facts. Vanessa, meanwhile, grew into the role of family interpreter. She had a way of explaining me to others that sounded generous, but always landed slightly off. If I declined a gathering, she would say I was overwhelmed with work. If I pushed back on a decision, she would laugh and say I didn't trust anyone. It wasn't malicious. At least, not overtly. It was efficient. By the time anyone spoke to me directly, the narrative had already been set. I didn't realize how often she spoke for me until I noticed how rarely anyone asked me anything. There were moments when the imbalance flickered into focus, a conversation that went quiet when I entered the room, a plan made without my input that assumed my compliance. But I told myself I was being sensitive. Families were complicated. Everyone had a role. Mine just happened to be less visible. Aunt Margaret was the only one who never played along. She had retired from nursing years before, her manner still brisk, her advice still blunt. She never asked how I was feeling. She asked what my labs said. She asked if I had copies of everything. When I told her once that I trusted my family, she raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which somehow felt more alarming than any warning. "Medical systems don't care who you love," she said once, handing me a folder I hadn't realized she'd organized for me. "They care what's documented, and families are terrible with documentation." At the time, I laughed it off. I thought she was projecting her professional cynicism onto my life. I followed her advice with insurers and doctors, but I didn't extend that caution inward. Blood, I believed, came with its own protections. My father's death changed the temperature of everything. Grief arrived first, heavy and disorienting. Then logistics followed, brisk and impersonal. Meetings with lawyers, discussions about assets, timelines that didn't pause for emotion. In the weeks after the funeral, I noticed how quickly conversations shifted from remembrance to management. Who would handle what? Who should speak for whom? Vanessa stepped naturally into the center of that activity. She coordinated calls. She relayed updates. She positioned herself as the point of contact, the one who could be trusted to keep things moving. No one questioned it. She was good at it. And I was tired. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled, the dynamic would relax, that I didn't need to be involved in every detail to be respected. But as the estate process moved closer to court, small things began to feel off. Decisions were framed as done before I had weighed in. Assumptions were made about my availability, my stamina, my willingness to participate. My name appeared in sentences I hadn't spoken. When the insurance cancellation happened, something in me finally aligned. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a continuation. A system that had learned over years that my needs could be deprioritized without consequence, that my absence could be managed, explained, justified. The only difference now was that the stakes were visible. Sitting alone that evening, surrounded by documents and the quiet ache of my body, I replayed years of moments I had dismissed as insignificant. The way Vanessa spoke for me, the way my mother reframed my objections, the way my pain had been folded into my personality until it was no longer treated as real. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had resisted for decades. What if my role in this family was not misunderstood, but designed? What if being the difficult one made it easier to move me aside? The thought didn't make me angry at first. It made me still, clear. I could feel the edges of something solid forming beneath the fear. Understanding, finally, that this wasn't about love or lack of it. It was about control. And once I named that, I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer afford to be interpreted. The confirmation arrived the next morning, not as an apology or a correction, but as a PDF attachment labeled Final Coverage Determination. It felt deliberate in its finality, as if the system wanted to close the door before I could put my foot in it. The document was precise: my policy number, my date of birth, the procedure code for my surgery, now marked denied. Under reason for closure, the language was neutral to the point of cruelty. Voluntary withdrawal of benefits. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Someone had not only asked for my coverage to be canceled, they had affirmed the decision. I read it the way I read client files at work, line by line, noting the structure. The phrasing told me what steps had been taken. This wasn't a missed payment or an incomplete form. This required verification. It required confidence. It required someone who knew how the system listened. I logged into my own records and pulled the activity history. There were no outgoing requests from me, no electronic signatures, no consent forms uploaded. The absence was as loud as the cancellation itself. The system showed an action without a source, which meant the source existed somewhere else. When I called the insurer again, I asked to be escalated. I kept my voice calm, professional, the way I had been trained. The representative on the other end spoke carefully, as if choosing words that wouldn't ripple. She confirmed the cancellation had been processed by phone. Identity verified. Decision reaffirmed. The notes indicated the caller had cited a long-standing condition that no longer warranted active coverage. I asked for the timestamp. I asked whether the call had been recorded. There was a pause, just long enough for me to recognize it. Then, she said, yes. All calls of that type were recorded and archived for compliance. I asked one more question, the one that mattered. What details were used to verify identity? She hesitated before answering. Date of birth, policy number, and a contextual verification question related to my medical history. I felt my chest tighten. I asked her to read the note exactly as it appeared. She did. The caller had referenced the injury that initiated my condition, not the diagnosis, not the treatment, the incident itself, the kind of detail that lived in family memory, not public records. I thanked her and ended the call before my voice could change. The room felt smaller after that, not claustrophobic, just contained, like the walls had decided to listen. I stood slowly, bracing myself against the desk as pain flared down my leg, sharp and insistent. The physical reminder arrived on cue, as if my body wanted to underline the stakes. Later that afternoon, the hospital called to confirm what the document already made clear. Without active coverage, the surgery could not proceed. The earliest reschedule date would depend on reinstatement, and delays carried risk. Nerve damage, loss of mobility. The words were delivered gently, but they landed with weight. This was not a setback. This was a countdown. I told my family again, this time with less emotion and more detail. Vanessa responded with a calm that bordered on soothing. She said insurance companies made mistakes all the time. She suggested I was exhausting myself by assuming the worst. She reminded me that I had managed pain before and would manage it again. The surgery, she said, could wait. My mother focused on the process. She asked if I might have misunderstood something I'd signed months ago. She wondered aloud if stress could be affecting my memory. She told me to slow down, to stop turning everything into a crisis. Neither of them reacted to the timeline. Neither acknowledged that the cancellation coincided exactly with the court hearing. Their indifference was too clean, too coordinated, like a response rehearsed before the question was asked. That evening, the pain intensified. It always did when I pushed too hard, when stress compounded the damage. I lay on the couch with my leg elevated, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths the way my physical therapist had taught me. Each movement felt like a negotiation between will and consequence. As I lay there, I mapped the sequence in my head. My father's death, the estate entering review, the hearing date set, the insurance call placed, the surgery denied. Each event clicked into the next with mechanical efficiency. If I could not attend the hearing, my absence would be explained for me. Health issues, emotional strain, the same language my family had used for years to soften my disappearance. No one would question it. No one would ask if the absence was engineered. The realization settled slowly, not as panic, but as clarity. This wasn't about saving money. It wasn't even about inheritance in the narrow sense. This was about control over who was present when decisions were made. My body had become the lever. I sat up carefully and opened my laptop again. I pulled the call log the insurer had emailed me, redacted but time-stamped. I cross-referenced it with my calendar. The call had been made during a window when I was in a meeting at work, my phone untouched in my bag. The alibi was mundane, unassailable. Whoever made the call knew my schedule. I thought of Vanessa's visit, the way she had spoken about timing, about stress, about stepping back. I thought of my mother's insistence that I must have misunderstood. The pieces didn't accuse on their own, but together they formed a shape I could no longer ignore. By the time night fell, the fear had burned down to something steadier. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overreacting. The system had done exactly what it was asked to do. The question was no longer whether this was intentional. The question was how far it went. I closed my laptop and reached for my phone, not to call customer service, not to argue with family, but to search for someone who understood what happened when paperwork was weaponized. Someone who knew how to prove it. Because if my absence was the goal, then showing up was the only answer left. Vanessa showed up 2 days later without calling first. I was standing at the kitchen sink when the knock came. My weight shifted awkwardly to protect my hip. Through the peephole, I saw her familiar posture, relaxed and upright, as if she had arrived to deliver good news instead of walking into a situation she'd helped create. By the time I opened the door, my pulse had already quickened. "I was nearby," she said, stepping inside before I could respond. "I wanted to check on you." Her eyes moved through the apartment with a speed that had nothing to do with concern. The counters, the chair by the window, the laptop still open on the table. Only then did she look at me, her expression settling into something soft and practiced. "You look exhausted," she added. "This has been a lot." I nodded and closed the door, careful with the motion. Sitting hurt less than standing, but neither was comfortable. Vanessa remained upright, hands folded loosely in front of her, perfectly balanced. The contrast felt intentional. She asked about the pain in the vague way people do when they don't want details. I gave her none. She filled the silence easily, talking about logistics, about how overwhelming everything must feel right now. She spoke slowly, as if pacing the conversation for my benefit. It didn't take long for the message underneath to surface. "Honestly," she said, tilting her head, "with everything going on, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing if you stepped back from the court stuff. Just temporarily. Focus on your health." There it was, wrapped in concern, delivered gently, framed as an act of kindness. I didn't answer right away. I watched her instead, the way she leaned forward slightly, as if offering support while closing distance. I thought of all the times she'd spoken for me, how easily she slid into that role. "The lawyers can handle most of it," she continued. "You don't need to put yourself through that kind of stress. Dad would have wanted peace." Peace. The word landed like a cue, not a feeling. I asked her what she meant by stepping back. "Well," she said lightly, "you don't have to be there in person. Your condition is unpredictable. No one would fault you for prioritizing recovery." Unpredictable. Another word that had followed me for years, used to excuse decisions made without me. I felt a familiar pressure behind my eyes, the urge to explain myself, to justify my presence. I resisted it. "I spoke to a lawyer," I said instead, keeping my voice even. The shift was immediate, not dramatic but unmistakable. Vanessa's shoulders tightened. The rhythm of her speech faltered for half a second before recovering. "A lawyer?" she asked. "About the insurance?" "Yes." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I really think you're misreading this. Administrative things happen all the time. It doesn't mean someone did anything wrong." "I didn't say it did." Her fingers tapped together once, a small, unconscious motion. "You just don't want to make accusations you can't take back." There it was. Not denial. A warning. I mentioned that the lawyer specialized in insurance fraud, that he was reviewing the call records. I said it casually, as if it were a minor detail. Vanessa's breath caught, just barely, but enough. That seems extreme, she said quickly. Dragging outsiders into family matters never ends well. Family matters. As if the system that decided whether I could walk was a private affair. She started talking faster then, her words overlapping slightly. She explained how insurance verification worked, how mistakes could look intentional if you didn't understand the process. She used terminology I recognized immediately, broker language, internal phrasing. I let her speak. When she referenced a specific step in the cancellation process, one that wasn't public-facing, my suspicion hardened into certainty. She stopped herself, too late, her mouth closing on the word as if she could pull it back. We looked at each other for a moment, the air between us taut. You've done your research, I said quietly. Her smile returned, sharper this time. I just want what's best for you. She stood soon after, smoothing her jacket as if preparing to exit a meeting that hadn't gone as planned. At the door, she paused and looked back at me. Try not to spiral, she said gently. You've always had a tendency to overthink. The door closed behind her with a soft click. I didn't move for several seconds. My body ached, but the pain felt distant compared to the clarity settling in my chest. That visit hadn't been about checking on me. It had been a test, a way to see how much I knew, how likely I was to comply. She hadn't asked if I needed help. She hadn't offered solutions. She had offered removal. I replayed the conversation in my head, isolating the moments that mattered. The language she used, the process she referenced, the way fear flickered through her composure when I mentioned the lawyer. This wasn't concern. It was damage control. I opened my laptop again and wrote everything down while it was still fresh. The phrasing, the timeline, the exact words she'd used. I saved the file in 3 places, labeled and dated. When the pain surged, I breathed through it and kept typing. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. I closed the laptop and sat back, exhausted but resolute. For years, my family had treated my presence as optional, my needs as negotiable. They had built a narrative where my absence could be explained away with concern and soft language. Vanessa had just confirmed what I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be resolved with patience. It was a strategy, and strategies only worked if you let them. I reached for my phone and opened my calendar, blocking off time for the following week. There would be no more casual conversations, no more assumptions of goodwill. From this point forward, everything went through counsel. If they wanted me gone, they would have to do better than kindness. Because I wasn't stepping back. I was stepping in. Daniel Brooks didn't ask me to calm down. That was the first thing I noticed when we sat across from each other in his office. A narrow room lined with filing cabinets instead of diplomas meant to impress. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the sequence of events, my voice steady, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. When I finished, he didn't offer reassurance or perspective. He asked for documents. "Show me everything," he said. "Not what you think matters. All of it." I slid the folder across the desk. Policy statements, emails, call logs, the PDF marked final coverage determination. He moved through them methodically, eyes sharp, expression neutral. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel judgmental. It felt focused. "This wasn't careless," he said finally. "It was executed." The word landed cleanly. He explained how voluntary cancellations worked in practice, the safeguards built into the system, the verification layers meant to prevent exactly this kind of misuse. Then he pointed to the language in the cancellation notes, the phrasing that signaled intent rather than confusion. Whoever made the call knew how to sound certain. They knew which boxes to check. This kind of thing happens most often within families, he added. Access, familiarity, motive. It's not random. I didn't flinch. By then, I didn't need convincing. Daniel requested records from the insurer under a compliance review. He moved faster than I expected, citing regulations with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. When the call archive arrived, he listened to it alone first, headphones on, back turned to me. I watched his shoulders shift slightly, a subtle change that told me something mattered. When he played it back, my own voice echoed through the room, familiar and wrong all at once. The cadence was close enough to pass, the answers confident. The caller spoke about my condition with a fluency that suggested lived knowledge, not rehearsed facts. Then came the detail that made my stomach drop, a reference to the incident that started everything, not the diagnosis, not the surgery, the moment itself. Daniel stopped the recording. That's not something a broker would guess, he said. That's memory. He pulled up a second document, one I hadn't known existed. A supplemental authorization required due to the cost of my surgery. A secondary confirmation, signed and submitted hours after the call. The signature belonged to my mother. I stared at the page, the ink neat and deliberate. She had signed as a family representative, affirming that the cancellation reflected my wishes. There was a justification attached, language about autonomy and patient choice. The words were clean. The implication was not. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I felt something colder settle in my chest. Recognition. They coordinated this, Daniel said quietly. One initiates. One legitimizes. That removes doubt. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. There's something else you need to understand. Your medical records show repeated warnings about delaying surgery. That means whoever did this knew there was risk. That elevates the issue. From what to what? I asked. From interference to harm. The room felt smaller then, not suffocating, concentrated. Daniel outlined the consequences plainly. Delayed intervention could lead to permanent mobility loss, nerve damage, chronic instability. All of it documented, all of it communicated to the insurer. This wasn't ignorance. It was a calculated gamble with my body. They weren't just trying to slow you down, he said. They were trying to stop you. The words echoed long after he said them. We talked about options: quiet resolution, private confrontation, formal complaint. Then Daniel paused and looked at me directly. There's also the court, he said. If you attend, and if the judge allows it, this evidence can be entered into the record. Publicly. The thought sent a tremor through me, not of fear, but of gravity. Once I stepped into that space, there would be no softening, no family language to obscure intent. Just facts, played aloud. Can I physically do that? I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. That's a question only you can answer. But understand this. If you don't show up, the narrative gets written without you, and this evidence may never see daylight. I thought of Vanessa's visit, the way she had framed my absence as reasonable. I thought of my mother's signature, steady and unquestioned. I thought of the years I had spent shrinking my needs to avoid conflict. I'll be there, I said. Daniel nodded once, not triumphantly, just decisively. Then we prepare. Over the next hour, we organized everything. Copies made, files labeled, timelines aligned. He instructed me not to speak to my family again, not to hint at what was coming. Let them believe the plan was working. When I stood to leave, pain flared down my leg, sharp and immediate. I steadied myself against the chair, breathing through it, Daniel watched without comment. Outside, the air was cold and clean. I sat in my car for a moment before turning the key, letting the reality settle. The truth existed now, independent of me, recorded, verified, ready. Whatever happened next, this was no longer a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a choice my family had made, documented in their own words. And for the first time, I wasn't carrying it alone. They had counted on my silence, on my absence, on my body giving out before I could speak. They were wrong. I drove home carefully, every movement deliberate, every mile a commitment. The pain followed me, as it always did, but beneath it was something steadier. Resolve. If my presence was the threat, then presence was exactly what I would offer, no matter the cost. The night before the hearing, sleep came in fragments. I lay on my back with pillows arranged carefully around my hip, every shift of weight negotiated like a contract I couldn't afford to break. The pain had a rhythm now, familiar enough that I could predict its surges, unfamiliar enough that it still demanded attention. My doctor had warned me not to travel, not to sit for long periods, not to put myself under stress. All reasonable advice, all impossible. I thought about what would happen if I didn't go. Vanessa would explain it for me. She would speak gently about my health, about how fragile things were right now, about how everyone understood. My absence would be framed as responsibility, not removal. The court would proceed. Decisions would be made. I would be left with outcomes I hadn't consented to and no space to challenge them. I took my medication, careful with dosage, aware of the line between relief and fog. I needed to be present, not just physically but mentally. Pain I could manage. Disorientation I could not. By morning, my body felt like it had aged overnight. I moved slowly, deliberately, choosing clothes that wouldn't restrict movement, shoes that favored stability over appearance. I packed documents I already knew Daniel had copies of, not because I needed them, but because carrying them felt like an act of defiance. I did not ask my family for a ride. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. Traffic moved around me as if the world were proceeding normally, unaware that everything I cared about was narrowing toward a single room. I parked farther away than I would have liked, giving myself time to move carefully, to breathe through the walk. Inside, the building smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. The floors were polished, unforgiving. I checked in, my name echoing slightly as the clerk repeated it. Eleanor Ashcroft. Present. The reaction was immediate. I didn't have to look directly to feel it, the shift in attention, the recalibration. I caught sight of my mother, first, seated near the aisle, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. She looked up, startled, then quickly away. Vanessa stood a few rows ahead, speaking with one of the attorneys. When she saw me, her expression froze for half a second before smoothing itself back into place. She hadn't expected me. That knowledge steadied me more than any medication could have. We took our seats. I chose a position where I could sit without twisting, my spine supported, my feet planted firmly on the floor. The pain pulsed, sharp and insistent, but I welcomed it in a strange way. It anchored me in my body, in the reality of why I was there. The hearing began with routine formalities, estate summaries, procedural language, lawyers speaking in measured tones about assets and intent. I listened without reacting, watching instead. Vanessa spoke when prompted, her voice calm, almost reassuring. She mentioned my health in passing, framed as a consideration, a reason certain responsibilities had been shared. I let her talk. I had spent years interrupting myself, correcting perceptions before they hardened. Today, I stayed silent. Silence, I was learning, could be strategic. When Daniel stood, it was not dramatic. He didn't raise his voice or gesture broadly. He simply requested permission to address a matter affecting the integrity of the proceedings. The judge hesitated, glanced at the opposing counsel, then nodded. The room shifted again. Daniel spoke clearly, outlining the existence of evidence related to potential insurance fraud and identity misuse, actions that directly impacted my ability to participate in the hearing. He emphasized relevance, not accusation, process, not emotion. The judge asked a few questions. I answered when required, my voice steady despite the effort it took to remain upright. Each word felt weighted, not with fear, but with finality. Vanessa's composure tightened. She sat straighter, her jaw set. My mother stared at the table in front of her, unmoving. Daniel requested authorization to play an audio recording. There was a pause that felt longer than it was. The judge considered, then granted limited permission. In that moment, everything narrowed. I became acutely aware of my body, of the way my muscles trembled slightly from strain, of the heat behind my eyes. I focused on my breathing, slow and measured. I would not leave this room unless I was carried out. As the equipment was prepared, I glanced once at Vanessa. Her confidence had not returned. There was calculation there now, rapid and desperate, as if she were running through outcomes, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. I thought of the night before, of the choice between comfort and presence, of the way absence had always been made to look reasonable in my family. Today, reason had nothing to do with it. The judge nodded to proceed. Daniel pressed play. The sound system hummed softly, then settled into silence. The first words were seconds away, suspended in the air like a held breath. I didn't know exactly how the room would react. I didn't know what would happen once the truth was no longer contained, but I knew this much with absolute certainty. They had built their plan on the assumption that my body would fail before I could speak. I straightened slightly in my chair, pain flaring in response, and welcomed it. Let it be seen. Let it exist alongside the truth. I was here, and I was not leaving. The recording began with a soft click, the kind of sound no one pays attention to until it becomes evidence. Then my voice filled the courtroom. It sounded like me in the way a reflection sounds like its source, close enough to convince, confident, calm. The caller stated my full legal name without hesitation, answered verification questions smoothly, spoke about my policy as if it were familiar territory. There was no fumbling, no uncertainty. Whoever had made the call knew exactly how to be believed. I felt the room lean in. When the caller said the words, "I don't need these benefits anymore," a murmur rippled through the benches. The phrase landed differently out loud than it had on paper. It carried intent, finality, the kind of certainty people associate with choice. Then came the detail that changed everything. The caller referenced the incident that caused my condition, not as a diagnosis code or a medical abstraction, but as a memory, a specific moment, a location, something that lived outside charts and files. The air in the room tightened as the implication settled. This was not a stranger. This was not a mistake. I didn't look at my family. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift without seeing it, like pressure changing before a storm breaks. My mother was the first to make a sound. "Stop it!" she said, her voice sharp and panicked, cutting through the recording. "Turn that off!" The judge raised a hand, but it was already too late. The damage was done. Her reaction had answered questions no one had yet asked. She knew what was coming. She had known all along. Vanessa stood abruptly, the movement sudden and unsteady. For a moment I thought she might speak, try to reclaim the room with explanation or outrage. Instead, her knees buckled. She collapsed into the chair behind her, her composure shattering in full view of the court. the silence that followed was not sympathetic. It was evaluative. As the recording continued, my mother's signature appeared on the screen, enlarged and unmistakable. The supplemental authorization. Her name. Her handwriting. The justification she had provided to legitimize the cancellation. The words looked smaller, projected like that, stripped of the authority they must have felt like when she wrote them. I watched her shoulders slump, watched the moment the weight of it all pressed down without denial to cushion the fall. The judge asked questions then, direct ones, about motive, about timing, about why such drastic action had been taken days before a critical hearing. Vanessa tried to answer at first, her voice brittle, but the words tangled. She spoke about stress, about wanting to protect the family, about how I had always been fragile. That word again. Fragile. Something inside me finally snapped into alignment. Before Daniel could object, Vanessa blurted out what she must have rehearsed 100 times in private. She said I had always been like this. Always hurt. Always limited. That the surgery was just another example of me needing special treatment. The room absorbed her words, then rejected them. Daniel asked for permission to address context. The judge nodded. What followed was not dramatic. It was methodical. Daniel laid out the history of my condition, the medical records documenting the origin of the injury, the inconsistencies that had never been publicly addressed. Then he introduced the past. The accident. The storage building behind our childhood home. The day my life tilted permanently, though I had never been told why. The records showed trauma inconsistent with an accidental fall. Notes from physicians questioning the explanation they were given. Questions that were answered just enough to close the file. Vanessa's face drained of color. My mother began to cry then, not loudly, but with the kind of broken restraint that suggested long practice. The judge listened as Daniel explained what the records implied, that the injury had not been random, that it had been caused, that the truth had been buried to protect a child who would otherwise have faced consequences. I felt the memory stir, not as a clear image, but as a sensation. The smell of dust, the shock of pain, the confusion of waking up in a hospital bed with a story already decided for me. Vanessa spoke again, this time with desperation stripping away polish. She said she had been young, that it had been an accident, that our parents had told her to stay quiet, that they had promised everything would be okay if she did. And for her, it had been. The judge's expression hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. It became obvious then why the narrative of my fragility had been so carefully maintained, why my pain had been minimized instead of investigated, why my absence had always been so easy to explain. To live with what they had done, my family needed to believe that I was already broken. The will was addressed next. My father's ethical clause was read into the record, its language precise and unforgiving. Vanessa's inheritance was conditional. Restitution was required for the medical costs I had carried for years, costs that traced back to an injury she had caused and others had concealed. Refusal would result in forfeiture. Vanessa stared at the document as if it were written in another language. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, almost painful sense of release. The truth no longer required my defense. It existed independently now, supported by evidence, acknowledged by strangers who had no reason to protect family myths. When the judge recessed the hearing, people stood slowly, voices hushed. My mother did not look at me. Vanessa could not. Daniel leaned toward me and spoke softly, but I barely heard him. I was too busy noticing something else. The pain was still there. My body was still compromised. But the weight I had carried for decades, the unspoken question of whether I was somehow responsible for my own suffering, was gone. For the first time in my life, The room knew what my family had always hidden, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt finished with hiding. The courthouse emptied slowly, as if the building itself needed time to absorb what had been said inside it. I remained seated for a moment after everyone else stood, letting the noise recede into a low murmur. My body ached in a familiar, relentless way, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like proof that I had stayed. When I finally rose, carefully, deliberately, I noticed something small and unexpected. No one rushed me. No one spoke over me. The space I occupied was mine. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. I took a breath that felt deeper than the ones I'd been taking for years. Not relief exactly. Resolution. The legal consequences unfolded without spectacle. Investigations were opened. Statements were taken. Timelines reconstructed by people who had no emotional investment in preserving a family story. Vanessa's situation moved into the hands of professionals who dealt in facts, not excuses. My mother's involvement was addressed with the same precision. There were no dramatic apologies, no cinematic breakdowns. Accountability arrived knowing it didn't need an audience. I didn't push for the harshest outcomes. That surprised some people. It didn't surprise me. What I wanted was not to destroy anyone. What I wanted was for the truth to be acknowledged and for the damage to stop. Punishment without understanding would have changed nothing. Responsibility did. Within weeks, my insurance was reinstated. The surgery was rescheduled. The hospital called with a tone that was careful, almost respectful, as if the system itself had learned something. When I checked in on the morning of the procedure, I felt fear. Yes, but it was clean fear, honest fear, not the compounded terror of being dismissed and endangered at the same time. Recovery was not quick or graceful. Healing never is. There were days when progress felt invisible, when pain returned without explanation. But there was forward motion, and that mattered. For the first time, my body was being treated as something worth preserving, not something to work around. A month later, the executor contacted me about my father's belongings. I went through them alone. There were medical records I had never seen, carefully organized, dating back to the injury. Notes from doctors who had questioned the explanation they were given. A journal filled with my father's handwriting, entries that circled the truth without ever naming it. He had known. He had chosen silence. Understanding that didn't absolve him, but it allowed me to stop imagining alternatives that never existed. I didn't keep the journal. I read it once, then closed it. Some truths are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be acknowledged and set down. I also found the documents related to his charitable foundation. In the months that followed, I assumed partial control and redirected its focus. We began funding advocacy work for people who had been financially or medically manipulated by family members. Quiet cases, the kind that never make headlines, the kind where paperwork becomes a weapon and silence does the rest. It felt right to turn what had nearly destroyed me into something that prevented harm for someone else. As for my family, I chose boundaries over erasure. I did not cut everyone off. I also did not return to how things were. Contact became conditional. Conversations required honesty. Accountability was not optional. Some days were easier than others. Healing did not follow a straight line, and neither did forgiveness. That, too, was a kind of progress. What surprised me most was how little anger I carried once the truth was out in the open. For years, I had believed my pain was something to manage quietly, something that made me inconvenient. I had mistaken endurance for virtue and silence for maturity. It took nearly losing my ability to stand in a courtroom to understand what had actually been taken from me. It wasn't just my health. It was my right to be present. Now, when I look at my life, I don't see a story about revenge. I see a story about reclamation, about what happens when you refuse to disappear so others can remain comfortable, about how systems fail people every day, and how clarity, not cruelty, is what forces change. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know something. Being dismissed does not mean you are wrong. Being minimized does not mean you are weak. And choosing to stay does not make you difficult. It makes you honest. If you've ever had to fight to be taken seriously by the people who were supposed to protect you, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. You never know who might recognize themselves in your words and realize they're not alone. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about truth, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. We share these stories every week, not for drama, but for recognition. Because no one should have to disappear to keep the peace, and you deserve to be seen.